A former millionaire rents her apartment to a polite and helpful tenant. She starts depending on him for companionship and assistance around the house, but she notices items missing and strange noises at night. Her suspicions towards he grow after learning about his criminal record. Linda Carter stood at the window of her spacious yet increasingly lonely suburban home, watching the autumn leaves dance whimsically down the quiet street. Since her husband passed away 2 years ago, the silence of the house seemed to echo louder each day. At 58, Linda was vibrant and active, but the evenings were long and the nights longer. Her children, now adults, had moved to cities driven by their careers and youthful adventures. To combat the loneliness and the unsettling feeling of an empty house, Linda had made a decision. She was going to rent out the downstairs apartment. It was a practical choice. It offered security, company, and a bit of extra income, which never hurt. As she placed the final touches on the rental listing, her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her old Labrador, Max, thumping his tail against the hardwood floor, signaling the arrival of someone at the door. It was Judy, her neighbor and closest friend, bustling in with her usual energy. "So, you've finally decided to take the plunge," Judy exclaimed, her eyes scanning the freshly painted "For Rent" sign leaning against the hallway wall. "Yes, I can't stand the quiet anymore," Linda confessed, pouring 2 cups of tea. "And, well, it might be nice to have someone else around." 2 weeks passed before she got a response that felt right. Greg Mitchell, a writer looking for a quiet place to work on his book, seemed like a perfect fit. His application was straightforward, his references impeccable, and during their video chat, his demeanor was polite and reassuring. Greg was in his mid-30s, unassuming with a warm smile that reached his eyes, a stark contrast to the brooding type she had envisioned when she thought of writers. He spoke fondly of his previous stays in small towns and his love for peaceful settings, exactly what Linda's neighborhood provided. The day Greg moved in was brisk and sunny. Linda watched as he unloaded his modest number of boxes, mostly books and writing supplies, into the apartment. He was organized and efficient, traits that Linda admired. After the last box was carried in, Greg joined Linda on the porch for a cup of coffee, a small thank you for her help. "I really appreciate this, Linda. It's the perfect spot to finish my novel," he said, looking genuinely content as he glanced around the well-tended garden that surrounded the house. "You're welcome, Greg. I hope you find the peace you need here," Linda replied, feeling a surprising sense of relief wash over her. Maybe this was exactly what she needed too, someone around to share the simple moments. As Greg settled in over the following days, Linda noticed the small ways he made life easier. He took it upon himself to fix a loose hinge on the garden gate and replaced a flickering bulb in the hallway without being asked. His presence brought a new energy to the house, one that Linda hadn't realized she missed. Each evening, they would share stories from their days. Linda about her book club and garden, Greg about the characters in his novel. It was comfortable, and Linda found herself looking forward to these conversations more each day. Life with Greg in the house settled into a pleasant routine. Every morning, Linda would find the newspaper delivered not just to her doorstep, but right to the kitchen table, courtesy of Greg's early morning habits. She often woke to the comforting sounds of Greg typing away in his makeshift study, the clacking of the keys, a stark contrast to the silence she had grown accustomed to. One Saturday, as autumn deepened and the air chilled, Greg spent the afternoon raking leaves in the yard, a chore he insisted on taking over. You've done enough of this over the years, Linda. Let me handle it," he had said with a smile when she offered to help. Later, they sat down with steaming mugs of hot chocolate, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with strokes of orange and purple. It was easy for Linda to admit now, having Greg around was a blessing. He was not just a tenant, but a companion who brought a semblance of life back to her quiet home. However, beneath the surface of this newfound companionship, subtle changes began to unsettle Linda. It started with small, almost negligible things. A book misplaced, not where she had left it. Her favorite pen, a beautiful fountain pen gifted by her late husband, went missing. Initially, Linda attributed these discrepancies to her own forgetfulness, but then, one evening, as she prepared dinner, she noticed the back door ajar, a door she was certain she had closed. Greg was out at a writers' meetup, and Linda felt a shiver run down her spine. She walked through the house, checking each room, the comforting familiarity of her home now tinged with a thread of anxiety. Returning to the kitchen, Linda's thoughts were interrupted by Greg's return. He apologized for being late, his face flushed from the cold. Linda mentioned the door, trying to keep her voice even, but Greg simply chalked it up to the wind. These old doors, they don't always catch properly," he said, adjusting the latch with ease. That night, Linda lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the house. The incident with the door had sparked a niggling doubt in her mind. Was Greg as trustworthy as he seemed, or was she letting her imagination, fueled by the loneliness and the recent changes, get the better of her? The incident with the back door, though seemingly minor, acted as a catalyst for Linda. Over the next few days, her discomfort grew, fueled by small but accumulating anomalies. Her kitchen scissors were found in the garden shed, her sewing kit appeared in Greg's part of the house, and there were nighttime sounds of movement she couldn't attribute to the old house settling. Driven by a mix of curiosity and mounting concern, Linda decided to take a cautious look into Greg's background. She started online, checking social media and public records. Her search was inconclusive at first. Greg's online presence was minimal, almost meticulously clean. However, a deep dive into forums and writers' groups revealed a few posts under Greg's name that hinted at previous disputes over copyright and plagiarism. With each new piece of information, Linda's wariness intensified. She pondered over her next move, aware that her snooping might breach Greg's privacy and potentially harm their relationship. But the need for reassurance pressed heavier on her heart. Linda's unease compelled her to take a further step, one she never thought she'd consider. While Greg was out for his weekly writers' group meeting, she found herself standing hesitantly outside his apartment door in the basement. The trust that had so easily been established was now tinged with suspicion, and after a moment of internal debate, she turned the knob, finding it unlocked. Inside, Greg's apartment was tidy and sparsely decorated, much like she had seen before. However, with a different intent, Linda surveyed the room for anything out of the ordinary. Her heart raced as she spotted a small, slightly ajar panel in the wall behind some books. Pushing the books aside, she hesitantly opened the panel to reveal a hidden compartment. Inside, Linda found a collection of items that chilled her to the bone. Multiple IDs with Greg's picture, but different names, a stack of cash bundled together, and several small, expensive-looking electronics that seemed out of place. The sight of these items, hidden so carefully, confirmed her worst fears. Greg was not merely a writer seeking solitude. Trembling, Linda quickly replaced everything as it had been and left the apartment, closing the door quietly behind her. The revelation left her with a heavy burden. Confronting Greg was now inevitable, but she had to approach the situation carefully, aware of the potential danger she might be in. As evening settled in and the golden hues of sunset bled into twilight, Linda sat in her living room, a turmoil of emotions churning inside her. The images of the hidden compartment and its contents played over in her mind like a sinister slideshow. Greg's smiling face, once a source of comfort, now seemed a mask for something far more ominous. She heard Greg's footsteps as he returned, a cheerful greeting floating up from the entrance. Linda's heart pounded in her chest as she prepared herself, not just for a confrontation, but for the unforeseeable reactions it might provoke. She called him into the living room under the pretense of discussing a plumbing issue that had cropped up earlier in the day. Greg entered, his expression open and friendly, unaware of the storm brewing. As he sat down, Linda's voice trembled slightly as she began, "Greg, there's something we need to discuss." She paused, gauging his reaction. Greg's face registered mild concern, but no alarm. "I found something in your apartment today," Linda continued, her voice gaining strength. Greg's eyes narrowed, a flash of something dark crossing his features before he composed himself. "Oh? What was it? Something wrong?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. Linda took a deep breath, the words heavy on her tongue. "I found a hidden compartment behind some books. It had many personal items, things that don't make sense to me." She watched as Greg's posture stiffened, his mask beginning to crack. Greg paused, his eyes darting towards the door momentarily. Calculating, turning back to Linda, his voice was soft but carried an edge. "Linda, I can explain. It's not what you think." His explanation was vague, filled with half-truths about needing to keep personal documents safe and some cash on hand from his freelance work. But Linda was unconvinced. The multiple IDs were too suspicious, the electronics too unusual. "Greg, I need to know who I'm really living with. The truth, please," she insisted, her tone firm yet pleading. The tension hung palpable between them as Greg looked down, his hands clasped tightly. Finally, he sighed, a long, weary exhalation. "You deserve the truth," he admitted. But before he could continue, there was a sudden, loud knock at the door. The knock at the door startled both Linda and Greg, effectively cutting off their intense conversation. Linda's heart raced as she wondered if this interruption was a random visitor or something more sinister linked to the secrets Greg was harboring. As Greg stood to answer the door, Linda felt a mix of relief and dread, unsure of what confrontation or revelation awaited them on the other side. This cliffhanger leaves viewers anxious to see how the situation will unfold and who is at the door, pushing them to tune in for the next episode. Greg opened the door to reveal two police officers standing on the porch, their expressions stern. Linda's breath hitched in her throat as a wave of fear and confusion washed over her. One of the officers, a woman with sharp eyes, spoke first. "Good evening. We're looking for Greg Mitchell. Are you Mr. Mitchell?" she asked, her gaze piercing. "Yes, I am. How can I help you, officers?" Greg's voice was calm, but Linda noticed a slight tremor in his hands. The male officer, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward, holding out a badge. "We need to ask you a few questions about a series of thefts in your previous place of residence." Greg nodded, his face pale. "Of course, officers. I understand. May I ask what specifically these questions are regarding?" His tone was cooperative, but Linda sensed his growing anxiety. The officers exchanged a glance before the female officer answered, "We believe some stolen items may have made their way here. It's routine for us to check." Greg's response was measured, his loyalty side showing as he replied, "I'd be happy to help clear this up. Please, come in." As they entered, Linda's mind raced with questions about whether these thefts connected to the suspicious items she had found. Inside, the officers briefly explained their investigation, while Greg listened intently, nodding and answering their questions with a calm that Linda found increasingly mysterious. After a few tense minutes, the officers seemed satisfied and left, promising to be in touch if needed. Once the door closed behind them, Greg turned to Linda, his expression one of relief mixed with something else, a weariness that hadn't been there before. "I'm sorry you had to see that, Linda. It seems I can't escape some parts of my past." After the police left, the atmosphere in the house grew heavy with unspoken words. Linda, still reeling from the encounter, found herself grappling with her trust in Greg. She needed answers, and she needed them now. Greg, if we're going to continue living under the same roof, I need the whole truth from you. No more half-truths or evasions, Linda stated firmly, her resolve strengthening in the face of uncertainty. Greg sighed deeply, running his fingers through his hair. You're right, Linda, it's only fair. He paused, taking a moment to collect his thoughts before he began. A few years ago, I was involved with a group of people who didn't always abide by the law. I never stole anything, but I can't deny that I was part of the group. Linda listened intently as Greg detailed his past associations and his efforts to leave that life behind. He explained the IDs and cash were part of his escape plan, to start anew without ties to his former associates. As Greg's story unfolded, Linda felt her initial distrust wane, replaced by an understanding of his struggle and his efforts to change. However, she remained cautious, the seeds of doubt not entirely dispelled. I want to believe you, Greg, and I appreciate your honesty now, Linda responded after a moment of silence. But it's going to take some time for me to fully trust again. Let's take it one day at a time. Greg nodded, his expression grateful, yet tinged with sadness. Thank you, Linda. That's all I can ask for. The days following the police visit saw a noticeable change in the atmosphere of Linda's home. Greg became more withdrawn, spending long hours in his apartment or out at late meetings he vaguely mentioned. Linda respected his privacy, but couldn't shake off her concerns about his mysterious activities. One crisp evening, while tending to her garden, Linda noticed a car she didn't recognize slowly driving by her house. It paused, someone inside studying her home, before driving off. The same car appeared several times over the next few days, each time with the same lingering, cautious behavior. Feeling uneasy, Linda mentioned it to Greg, who tensed up immediately. "Did you get a good look at the driver?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. "No, they never got out. But why? Do you know who they might be?" Linda probed, her worry mounting. Greg hesitated, then sighed. "It might be someone from my past. I thought I'd left all that behind, but maybe they're not ready to let me go just yet." This revelation alarmed Linda, but before she could respond, the car returned, this time stopping directly in front of the house. Two men stepped out, looking up at the house with an intimidating presence. Greg quickly stepped in front of Linda, whispering, "Go inside, lock the doors, I'll handle this." As Linda watched from the window, her heart raced. Greg met the men at the end of the driveway, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. The conversation seemed tense. Greg's body language was defensive. After a few minutes, the men left, but the threat in their departure was palpable. Linda felt a mix of fear and frustration. That evening, Judy came over, having noticed the unusual visitors. Seeing her friend's distress, Judy's concern quickly turned to disapproval. "Linda, this is getting dangerous. These people aren't just going to go away. Is keeping him here worth your safety?" Linda was torn. Her sense of loyalty to Greg, who had been honest about his past, conflicted with her fear for her own safety. "He's trying to change, Judy." "We've all made mistakes," Linda defended, though her voice wavered with doubt. Judy shook her head, her expression stern. "There's a difference between making mistakes and bringing danger to your doorstep. You need to think about what you're getting into here." The confrontation with Judy left Linda feeling isolated. That night, she lay awake, the weight of her decisions pressing down on her. She had to admit Judy might be right. Perhaps her desire to help Greg had blinded her to the risks she was now facing. In the days following the unsettling visit from Greg's past associates, Linda's home felt less like a sanctuary and more like a fortress. Despite Judy's warnings, Linda couldn't bring herself to turn Greg away without trying to resolve the situation first. She proposed a meeting to discuss potential solutions and safety measures. During the meeting, Greg was visibly stressed, but cooperative. "I've contacted someone who might be able to help us deal with these guys for good," he explained. "An old friend who's now a private investigator. He can offer us protection and possibly mediate a resolution." Linda listened, her skepticism shadowed by hope. They decided to increase security around the house, installing new locks and surveillance cameras. Greg's PI friend would come by the following week to assess the situation and propose a more permanent solution. This proactive approach gave Linda a semblance of control, though the fear lingered. She appreciated Greg's efforts to protect her home, and their collaboration restored a measure of their earlier camaraderie. One evening, as Linda was locking up for the night, the peace was shattered by the sound of breaking glass from the back of the house. Heart pounding, she rushed to the kitchen where she saw a rock had been thrown through the window, a threatening note tied around it. Greg, hearing the commotion, came running. Seeing the note, his face turned pale. "They're not giving up," he murmured, reading the message. The note demanded that Greg meet them alone if he wanted to end this once and for all. Against Linda's protests, Greg insisted on handling the situation himself. "It's the only way to keep you out of this," he argued. "I'll meet them, settle this, and then it's over." The gravity in his voice left little room for argument. Later that night, Greg left for the meeting, leaving Linda to wait in agonizing suspense. Hours passed with no word from him. Unable to bear the silence, Linda called the PI, who promised to check on Greg's situation. As dawn broke with no return call and no sign of Greg, Linda's worry escalated into fear for his life, realizing just how dangerous his past really was and how it now threatened her own safety. The morning light brought no comfort to Linda, each minute stretching into agonizing uncertainty about Greg's fate. The previous night's fear turned into today's dread, with every unknown car that passed her house making her heart skip. Her fingers hovered over her phone, contemplating calling the police, but the private investigator's words to wait for his call held her back. Finally, her phone rang. It was the PI, his voice urgent. "Linda, Greg managed to resolve the issue last night, but not without complications. He's safe, but he's at the local hospital. He was roughed up pretty badly." Relief and horror washed over Linda in equal measure. She hurried to the hospital, her mind racing with questions about what had transpired. At the hospital, she found Greg bandaged, but smiling weakly at her. "I'm sorry for all this," he murmured as she approached his bedside. "Oh, what happened, Greg?" Linda asked, her voice a mix of concern and frustration. "It's over, Linda. I made sure they understood that coming back would mean more trouble than they could handle," Greg explained. His face was drawn, the shadows under his eyes speaking to the ordeal he'd endured. "They won't bother us again." Greg's assurance did little to ease the knot of worry in Linda's stomach. The violence of the night had brought a stark reality into her peaceful life, and she struggled with the repercussions of harboring someone with such a dangerous past. In the days following Greg's hospital release, Linda's home returned to a superficial normalcy. The windows were fixed, the security tightened, and Greg's wounds healed. However, the shadow of the recent violence lingered in every corner of the house, in every creak of the floorboards at night. Linda appreciated Greg's efforts to protect her and make amends, but the ordeal left her questioning the wisdom of her decisions. Judy visited often, her presence a comforting reminder of normality, yet even she tread lightly around the subject of Greg. One afternoon, while sharing tea in the garden, Judy finally broke the silence. "Linda, are you really okay with all this?" "It's a lot to handle for someone who just wanted a bit of company," Linda sighed, her gaze lost in the swirls of steam rising from her cup. "I don't know, Judy. I can't abandon him now, not after everything. But yes, I'm scared. I'm scared of what else his past might bring to our doorstep. Judy reached out, squeezing Linda's hand. Just remember, Linda, your safety comes first. No amount of loneliness is worth this risk. Their conversation was interrupted by Greg, who approached with a small tray of freshly baked cookies, a peace offering in his ongoing effort to mend the fences. "Ladies, I hope I can tempt you with some treats," he said, his smile hopeful but tinged with the knowledge of the unease he had caused. Linda forced a smile, accepting the gesture. As they nibbled on the cookies, the garden's tranquility contrasted sharply with the turmoil of recent events, a stark reminder of how quickly life could change. The morning after Greg's return from the hospital marked a new beginning in Linda's household. The sun shone brightly, casting long shadows across the garden, where the incident had left a palpable mark. Linda, sitting on her porch, sipped her coffee, her eyes tracing the contours of her once tranquil sanctuary, now tainted by the shadows of fear and distrust. Greg joined her, moving more cautiously with his injuries. His presence was both a comfort and a reminder of the risks she had unwittingly invited into her life. "Linda," he began, his voice low, carrying an earnest tone, "I can't thank you enough for not turning me away after everything that's happened." Linda offered a small, tentative smile. "Greg, we're past the worst of it now, I hope. Let's just focus on getting things back to normal, or as normal as they can be." Her words were optimistic, but her heart harbored reservations. She wondered if normalcy was a realm too far removed from their current reality. As they talked, Linda expressed her concerns about the future and the possibility of further threats. Greg reassured her, explaining that his actions the previous night had put a definitive end to the danger. "I've made it clear to my old contacts that my new life is off limits. They won't bother us again," he assured her, his confidence seeming to fill the space between them. Despite the reassurances, Linda felt the need to take proactive steps to ensure their safety. She contacted the private investigator Greg had involved, setting up a meeting to discuss long-term security measures for her home. The PI, a seasoned professional named Arthur, arrived later that day, bringing with him a sense of authority and calm. Arthur walked around the property, making notes and suggesting enhancements. Better lighting around the perimeter, high-definition security cameras, and even discussing the legalities of self-defense measures. Linda listened intently, her resolve strengthening with each practical step they outlined. During the meeting, Greg stayed mostly quiet, nodding in agreement with Arthur's suggestions. It was clear he respected the man's expertise and was grateful for the added layer of security being implemented for Linda's sake. By the end of the day, a plan was in place. The house would soon be fortified, transforming it from a vulnerable target to a stronghold. Greg and Linda watched as Arthur's team began the installation of the new security systems, a physical manifestation of their renewed vigilance. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the freshly secured home, Linda felt a weight lift off her shoulders. The measures might not erase the past, but they promised a safer future. Greg stood beside her, his presence a silent vow of his commitment to protect the peace and quiet they both cherished. A week had passed since the security upgrades were completed, and Linda's home had regained a semblance of the sanctuary it once was. The new security cameras, the reinforced doors, and the motion sensor lights all contributed to a feeling of safety that had been sorely missed. Linda was finally starting to relax, her evenings once again filled with the quiet activities she cherished. However, the peace was abruptly shattered one evening. As Linda prepared dinner, the calm was broken by the loud, insistent beeping of an alarm. The newly installed security system had detected movement at the back of the house. Linda's heart leapt into her throat as she rushed to the security monitor. The screen showed figures cloaked in darkness, attempting to bypass the garden sensors. Greg, hearing the alarm, sprinted into the room, his earlier injuries forgotten in the rush of adrenaline. "Stay here, Linda. Lock yourself in the bathroom," he instructed tersely, grabbing a baseball bat from the hallway closet. Linda, though terrified, nodded understandingly, her hands trembling as she watched Greg move towards the back door, ready to confront the intruders. As she locked herself in the bathroom, the sounds of confrontation erupted, shouts, the clatter of a struggle, and the ominous thud of bodies hitting the ground. Inside her makeshift sanctuary, Linda's mind raced with fear and worry for Greg's safety. The sounds of the struggle outside were harrowing, but soon a troubling silence fell. Minutes stretched into what seemed like hours, each second ticking by with excruciating slowness. Finally, there was a gentle knock on the bathroom door. "Linda, it's me," Greg's voice called softly, a stark contrast to the chaos that had just ensued. Linda opened the door to find Greg standing there, breathing heavily but unharmed. Behind him, two figures lay motionless, subdued and tied up. "The police are on their way," Greg explained, his face pale but composed. "They tried to get in, but the new security held them off long enough for me to deal with them." Linda, overwhelmed by relief and residual fear, embraced Greg tightly. "You could have been killed," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Greg held her, his response solemn. "I couldn't let anything happen to you, Linda, not after everything you've done for me." His words were heavy with the weight of his promise, a promise that had nearly cost him his life. As the police arrived and took the intruders into custody, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. Linda watched as the officers commended Greg for his bravery, and as reporters began to gather, drawn by the drama of the thwarted home invasion. That night, as the house quieted down again and the last of the police cars drove away, Linda and Greg sat together in the living room. The events of the evening had forged a new bond between them, a bond born of shared danger and mutual sacrifice. Greg's actions had not only saved their lives, but had also restored a measure of peace to Linda's world. After the confrontation, the community rallied around Linda and Greg, their ordeal becoming a local story of courage and resilience. In the days that followed, Linda found herself at the center of attention, her quiet life now punctuated by visits from neighbors and even local journalists eager to cover the story of the heroic duo. Greg, though modest about his actions, received accolades for his bravery. The incident not only cleared his name, but also showcased his genuine transformation and commitment to his new life. As the public's perception shifted, so did Greg's sense of belonging and purpose within the community. During this time, Linda and Greg discussed the future more earnestly. Greg proposed continuing to live in the house, but in a new capacity, as Linda's official caretaker and security consultant, a role that would use his skills and ensure their mutual safety. Linda, seeing the sincere change in Greg and the protection he offered, agreed. This arrangement solidified their bond and established a new dynamic in the house. Linda resumed her peaceful activities with newfound vigor, comforted by the security that Greg's presence provided. The garden bloomed under their combined care, symbolizing the renewal of the home's spirit and their lives. The emotional toll of the siege was palpable, and both Linda and Greg had their moments of reflection and recovery. Linda, more than ever, appreciated the peace that now enveloped her home, her earlier fears gradually fading but not forgotten. Greg, for his part, dealt with the shadows of his past actions. The ordeal had brought everything full circle, providing him not just with redemption, but also a clear path forward. He worked closely with local security firms and even gave talks on personal safety, turning his once dubious expertise into a force for good. One quiet evening, as they sat watching the sunset from the porch, Linda turned to Greg, her expression thoughtful. "You know, Greg, I never expected when I rented that apartment to you that we'd end up here," she mused, a soft smile playing on her lips. Greg chuckled, his eyes warm. Life has a funny way of throwing us into the deep end, doesn't it? I'm just grateful I landed where I did. His gaze was sincere, reflecting his deep appreciation for the life he now had, thanks to Linda's belief in second chances. As autumn returned, bringing with it the anniversary of Greg moving into the apartment, Linda and Greg decided to host a community gathering in their garden. The event was meant to celebrate the community's spirit and resilience, featuring local musicians, food prepared by neighbors, and a small speech by Greg about safety and community support. The gathering was a success, drawing a large crowd and fostering a sense of unity and strength among the attendees. Linda felt a profound connection to those around her, her role in the community forever changed, but now embraced fully. As the guests left and the night settled in, Linda and Greg took a moment to appreciate the peace that had returned to their lives. "It's been quite a year, hasn't it?" Linda said, looking around at the garden lit by lanterns and fairy lights. "It certainly has," Greg agreed, his voice reflective. But I think we've come out stronger for it." As they stood together, the challenges of the past seemed to dissolve into the night, leaving behind a trail of lessons learned and friendships forged. Linda and Greg looked forward to the future, not with fear, but with the courage and hope that had seen them through their darkest times. If you enjoyed, consider subscribing to our channel and supporting us through the thanks button.